Hello friends, Matt here. This is the third video in a series of 4 where we are looking at 20 arguments for the existence of God from Kreeft and Tacelli's book, Handbook of Christian Apologetics. In this video, we'll look at arguments 11 through 15, and here we go. Argument 11 is the argument from eternal ideas. The fact is we have ideas in our minds of eternal truths, things like mathematics, for example. It is an eternal truth that 1 + 1 = 2. However, our minds are finite, and so our minds cannot be the source of eternal truths. Therefore, there must be some eternal infinite mind where these truths reside. This argument is especially appealing to Platonists, and it comes from Augustine, but Kreeft and Tacelli admit there's still quite a bit of work that has to be done before the argument is really persuasive. But it's included because it is an argument that people have given, and it has been persuasive for some. Argument 12 is the argument that comes from the idea of God that we have. We begin by recognizing that all of our ideas either come from ourselves or they come from something outside of us. We have an idea in our minds of an all-perfect, infinitely good God. Now, this idea of an infinite, all-perfect being can't come from ourselves because we are finite and imperfect. Therefore, that idea must have come from something outside of us that has those qualities. The objection comes that we have just looked at the goods and the grades of perfection around us and we've removed the limits. But we have to have in our heads this idea of perfection, infinite perfection, before we can recognize the standard. We have this idea of God and we recognize that this idea of God matches infinite perfection. So in order for the recognition to happen, we have to have had that idea of infinite perfection in the first place. And that idea of infinite perfection had to have come from somewhere outside of us because, again, we are not infinite or perfect. Argument 13 is what is commonly known as the ontological argument, and it comes from St. Anselm. There has been a lot of literature written about this argument. And some people argue that it doesn't work. Some people argue that it does. Kreeft and Tacelli offer 3 different versions of the argument in their book. So here, I'm just going to offer the first, and no collection of arguments for the existence of God is complete without it, and it has proven to be convincing for some people. So here it is. If we look at a thing that exists in reality and exists in our minds, we recognize that that's better than a thing that merely exists in our minds. Now, God is defined as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And so, if God only exists in our minds, then that's not the greatest thing that can be conceived, because a God that exists in reality and in our minds is greater than a God who exists only in our minds. And so, that than which nothing greater can be conceived has to exist both in reality and in our minds, not merely in our minds. Therefore, God exists outside of our minds. Argument 14 is the moral argument. Real moral obligation is a fact. It doesn't mean that we're always going to get it right. People disagree sometimes, but there is deep in us this notion that there is real moral obligation. And we see it expressed in all societies throughout the world and in all time, that there are these moral obligations that we ought to follow. Atheism, materialistic atheism, is incompatible with moral obligation because moral obligation is not a physical, material thing. Therefore, there is something more than the material from which our moral obligation comes. Now, this doesn't give us much. It just tells us that there's something beyond the mere physical and material world. But it does give us something, some objective source. As for the real moral obligation, if people want to deny the real moral obligation, then they have to admit that it is not intrinsically wrong or really wrong to do things like murder innocent people, abuse children, rape, commit holocausts. I mean, you name it, the worst atrocities in the world are not actually really wrong. Very few people are willing to admit that. And even those who are probably can't live that out on an everyday basis. Kreeft and Tacelli also bring up here this dilemma known as the Euthyphro dilemma because it comes from Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro. Does God command moral obligation because it's good, or is it merely good because God commands it? And the answer is neither. As we saw from the earlier arguments, God himself is the source and the standard of goodness. because of his being. Goodness comes from existence and being. It's not some separate thing like here's God, here's goodness. And our being comes from him, and so goodness is defined as what is compatible and natural and good for our being. Our being comes from him, and morality is a guide for us achieving the fullness of that being that he has given to us. And we have an obligation to him because that being is a gift from him. So the common Euthyphro dilemma assumes a law type of morality, whereas common Christian morality is more of virtue ethics. It has to do with the nature of things and the nature and the essence of God rather than a separate moral standard. Argument 15 is the argument from conscience, and it's a twist on the argument from morality. There are a lot of people who, in trying to avoid the idea of God, will deny objective morality. And it's something of a common thing in our society that people reject objective morality. However, everybody will say that we ought to obey our conscience. Even in rejecting morality, objective standard morality, they will say that people just ought to obey their conscience. Well, why? Where does the dictum come from that we ought to follow our conscience? Does it come from nature? Well, nature doesn't have any authority over us. Does it come from myself? Well, then I'm just making it up for myself. It's not objective in itself. Does it come from society? Well, even a lot of people, that doesn't add up to a source of authority. So the only answer is that even our objective standard that we ought to obey our conscience has to come from God. So now we've done 15 arguments, and I hope you stick around for the rest.